Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to guide you through tonight's journey. I know many of you use these videos to help you unwind or drift off to sleep. So before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind relax. Aiden and his wife, Sarah, had always dreamed of owning a big house in the countryside. They loved the peace and quiet, the fresh air, and the sense of escape from the city. After years of saving, they finally bought a beautiful, sprawling Victorian mansion that had been abandoned for years. The house needed some work, but they were excited to make it their own. As they moved in and began unpacking, they noticed something odd. The layout of the house didn't seem to match the floor plans. On the blueprints, there was supposed to be an extra room on the third floor, but they couldn't find it anywhere. They chalked it up to an error and forgot about it, too busy with renovations to think much of it. One rainy evening, Aiden was working late, and Sarah decided to explore the house on her own. She climbed up to the third floor, following the blueprint in her hand, curious about the missing room. She tapped along the walls, listening for a hollow sound, but everything seemed solid. Then, just as she was about to give up, she noticed a faint outline in the wallpaper, a seam that didn't match the rest of the pattern. Her heart raced as she pulled at the wallpaper, revealing a hidden door. The door was old and covered in dust, with a heavy iron latch. It creaked as she opened it, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into darkness. She felt a chill, but curiosity got the better of her, and she slowly descended the stairs, holding her phone flashlight in front of her. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, windowless room that smelled of damp and decay. The walls were lined with strange, faded drawings, and in the center of the room was an old, dust-covered rocking chair, facing a wall. On the floor beside it lay a doll, its eyes wide and staring, with a twisted, almost lifelike expression of fear. Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but something kept her rooted to the spot. She stepped closer to the drawings on the wall, noticing they were sketches of faces, all with wide, terrified eyes. It was as if someone had drawn them in a frenzy, capturing their horror in vivid detail. A faint whisper echoed in the room, making her jump. She whipped around, but there was no one there. The rocking chair creaked, moving ever so slightly, though there was no breeze. Her phone flickered, and for a split second, she thought she saw a shadowy figure reflected in the glass, a child, with hollow eyes and a wide, unnatural grin. She gasped and stumbled backward, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor, leaving her in complete darkness. Panic set in as she felt her way along the walls, searching for the door. But when she reached it, the latch wouldn't budge. She pounded on the door, shouting for help, but her voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. Then she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, moving toward her from the depths of the room. Her heart pounded as she backed up against the wall, her mind racing. The footsteps stopped just in front of her, and she felt an icy breath on her face, though she couldn't see anything in the darkness. "Leave," a voice whispered, so close she could feel it in her ear. "This room is not for you." At that moment, the door flew open, and Aiden stood there, his face pale. He pulled her out of the room, slamming the door shut behind them. Breathless and shaking, Sarah looked at him, unable to find words. "I heard you screaming," he said, his voice trembling. What was down there?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered, "but I don't think we're alone here." That night, they both lay awake, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The house felt different now, colder, darker, and filled with a quiet, lingering presence. They agreed to avoid the hidden room, hoping that whatever was there would leave them alone if they left it undisturbed. But things only got worse. Over the next few days, they began hearing footsteps echoing through the house at odd hours, always leading toward the hidden door on the third floor. Strange symbols appeared on the walls, symbols neither of them could recognize. They'd find objects moved from their places, and Sarah swore she saw a shadowy figure watching her from the corner of her eye. Desperate, they called a local historian who knew the area's lore. She listened to their story, her face growing pale as they described the hidden room. "That house once belonged to a family who disappeared mysteriously," she explained. "They say the youngest child, a little girl, was found alone, rocking in that room, clutching a doll and whispering about voices in the walls. She vanished a few days later, and no one ever saw her again." Aidan and Sarah exchanged horrified glances. What do we do?" Sarah asked. The historian sighed, looking at them with pity. "Leave. The house has claimed too many. It doesn't let go easily." Despite her warning, they decided to stay one last night, determined to pack up their things and leave first thing in the morning. But as darkness fell, they heard the whispers grow louder, filling every room, seeping through the walls. They locked themselves in the bedroom, huddled together, listening as the footsteps approached, louder and louder. A faint scratching sound echoed from the walls, as if someone were trying to claw their way inside. Then, just as they thought they couldn't bear it anymore, the door to their bedroom creaked open, and they saw her. A little girl with hollow, empty eyes, holding a doll in one hand. Her gaze was fixed on them, unblinking, her mouth twisted into a ghostly smile. "Come play with me," she whispered, her voice echoing like a distant memory. "I've been waiting for so long." The lights flickered, and the room grew colder. The girl's figure faded into the shadows, but her presence lingered, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. By morning, Aidan and Sarah had packed up and left, leaving everything behind. They never spoke of the house again, and they never returned. But sometimes, when they closed their eyes at night, they could still see her hollow eyes, still hear her faint whisper, calling them back to the forgotten room. Years ago, the Peterson family bought an old, crumbling house on the outskirts of town. The locals called it the Watching House, because it was built with tall windows that seemed to watch anyone passing by. Some said it was cursed, but the Petersons didn't believe in ghosts or curses. To them, it was just a house that needed fixing up, a new project, a fresh start. For the first few months, things were normal, though their teenage daughter, Emily, noticed odd things. Sometimes she'd hear footsteps echoing down the halls when no one was there, or feel a faint chill even when the windows were closed. Her parents laughed it off, saying it was just an old house settling. But one night, when Emily was alone in her room, she heard a faint whisper coming from the hallway. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she listened, the sound grew louder, like someone whispering her name. "Emily, Emily." She felt her heart pound. It was as if the voice was right outside her door. Gathering her courage, she got up and opened it, only to find the hallway empty. She closed the door quickly, her skin prickling with fear. She told herself it was just her imagination, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next day, Emily's parents were busy with renovations in the basement, where they'd discovered a hidden room under a trap door. As they cleared away the dust and cobwebs, they found a stack of old, faded photographs, each one showing different people who seemed to be staring directly at the camera, their eyes hollow, almost haunted. Her mother, intrigued, decided to hang the photos in the living room, despite Emily's protests. "They're a part of the house's history," her mother insisted. That night, as Emily walked past the living room, she stopped, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck rise. The eyes in the photographs seemed to follow her, their gazes intense, as if they were studying her. She quickly turned away, telling herself it was just her nerves. But the feeling of being watched lingered long after she'd left the room. Over the following weeks, things only got stranger. Objects began to move on their own. A book she'd left on her desk would turn up on the floor. Her shoes would be neatly placed by the door when she distinctly remembered leaving them elsewhere. Her parents brushed it off, thinking she was just being forgetful, but Emily knew something was wrong. One evening, as she was heading upstairs, she noticed the basement door was slightly open. From the shadows below, she heard the faint sound of someone humming an old tune, soft and eerie. She froze, her heart racing. Her parents weren't home and no one else was supposed to be there. Curiosity and fear battled within her, but the humming grew louder, drawing her in. She slowly made her way down the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. As she reached the bottom, the humming stopped, and silence filled the basement. She looked around, her flashlight flickering in the darkness. That's when she saw it, a faint outline of a figure in the corner of the room, watching her with hollow eyes. She gasped, backing away, but the figure didn't move. It was as if it was waiting for something, staring at her with a haunting intensity. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut above her, trapping her in the dark. She screamed, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. She felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder and she spun around, her flashlight illuminating nothing but empty space. Finally, the door opened, and her parents rushed in, worried by her screams. She tried to explain what she'd seen, but they looked at her with disbelief. They told her it was just her imagination, that the basement was empty. But Emily knew better. She could still feel the icy chill of that presence, the haunting stare of the figure in the shadows. Over the next few days, Emily noticed strange bruises on her arms and legs, marks she couldn't explain. At night, she'd wake up to see the shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with those same hollow eyes. Desperate for answers, Emily started researching the house's history. She learned that years ago, the house had belonged to a family who'd mysteriously vanished. Neighbors reported seeing strange figures in the windows and hearing whispers at night, but no one could explain what had happened to the family. One night, as Emily sat in her room, she felt a cold breeze sweep through, even though the windows were closed. The light flickered, and she heard the whisper again, clearer this time. "Help me. Find them." Emily's blood ran cold as the words echoed in her mind. She realized that the spirit was searching for the lost family, unable to find peace. Summoning her courage, she spoke aloud. "I don't know where they are, but I can help you." The room grew still, the chill fading as a sense of calm settled over her. The whispers stopped, and for the first time in weeks, she felt at ease. But the peace didn't last long. The next morning, her parents discovered strange messages scratched into the walls, messages pleading for help, asking for someone to find them. The presence grew stronger, and every night, Emily could feel the spirit watching her, desperate and restless. In a final attempt to rid the house of its haunting, Emily's family called in a paranormal investigator. The investigator conducted a seance, hoping to contact the spirit and help it move on. During the seance, the spirit spoke through the investigator, its voice filled with sorrow. "They were taken from me, hidden in the walls." With a growing sense of dread, Emily's father began searching the house, and soon they discovered a hidden compartment in the basement wall. Inside, they found a set of small, faded bones. A child who had been hidden away, long forgotten. After the discovery, the spirit's presence faded, and the house grew quiet. Emily no longer felt watched, and the whispers stopped. But the memory of those hollow eyes stayed with her, a reminder of the spirit that had been trapped in the watching house, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. Emma had always loved antique shops. There was something thrilling about owning an item with a mysterious history. So when she spotted a beautiful old mirror in a dusty corner of a shop, she bought it without a second thought. The mirror was large, with a thick, ornate frame carved with intricate patterns, and the glass had a faint, silvery glow that seemed almost alive. She hung it in her bedroom, admiring how it added a touch of elegance to the space. That night, however, as she lay in bed, she thought she heard a faint whisper. At first, she brushed it off as her imagination, but the whisper grew louder, echoing softly around the room. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the mirror. Curious, she got up and approached it, running her fingers over the cool glass. For a moment, everything was still, but just as she was about to turn away, she noticed something strange. Her reflection was smiling at her, even though she wasn't smiling back. Emma froze, staring in horror as her reflection's grin grew wider, stretching unnaturally across its face. She took a step back, her heart pounding, but the reflection stayed, watching her with dark, hollow eyes that didn't match her own. She tried to convince herself it was just a trick of the light, but over the next few days, the mirror only grew stranger. Sometimes, She'd catch glimpses of movement in its depths, shadows flickering just beyond her sight. Other times she'd see herself in the mirror, but with subtle, horrifying changes. Her eyes were darker, her skin paler, as though her reflection were becoming someone else entirely. One night, unable to bear the eerie presence any longer, she covered the mirror with a cloth and tried to sleep. But as she lay in bed, she heard the whispering start again, louder this time, almost angry. "Let me out!" Emma's skin prickled with fear, and she pulled the blankets over her head, hoping it was just a nightmare. But the whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Let me out, Emma." She didn't know how it knew her name, and she didn't want to find out. Trembling, she finally got up and yanked the cloth off the mirror, determined to throw it out in the morning. But as she looked into the glass, she realized with horror that her reflection was gone. Instead, she saw a dark, endless void, stretching back into nothingness. Slowly, a hand reached out from the darkness, pressing against the inside of the glass, followed by a face, her own, twisted and lifeless, staring back at her with an expression of pure malice. "Let me out," the reflection whispered, its mouth moving in perfect sync with Emma's own, though she wasn't speaking. Paralyzed with fear, Emma backed away, but the reflection leaned closer, pressing its hands against the glass, as if trying to push through to her side. In a desperate attempt to escape, Emma grabbed a nearby cloth and threw it over the mirror, her heart pounding as she backed out of the room. She locked the door behind her, hoping to keep whatever was in that mirror trapped inside. That night she slept on the couch, but the whispering continued, louder and louder, echoing through the house. Every mirror, every reflective surface seemed to carry the same voice, whispering, begging, demanding to be let out. The next morning, Emma decided she'd had enough. She wrapped the mirror in thick cloth, carried it outside, and drove to the edge of town, determined to get rid of it. She threw it into a river, watching as it sank beneath the water, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard a faint, familiar whisper coming from the mirror in her bathroom. "Thank you, Emma, for letting me out." Her blood ran cold, and she glanced toward the bathroom door, which had swung open on its own. Inside, she saw her reflection standing in the mirror, watching her with a sinister grin, a look of triumph in its hollow eyes. Emma realized, too late, that whatever she'd seen in that antique mirror had never wanted to be destroyed. It had wanted freedom, and now it was here. Lily was a travel writer, always eager to explore hidden places and forgotten sights. Her latest assignment took her to a small town with a dark history, a place where whispers of strange disappearances and haunted buildings were as common as the morning fog. Her main focus was an old Victorian mansion at the edge of town, known by locals as Ashgrove House. Built in the late 1800s, the mansion had been abandoned for decades after the last family living there vanished without a trace. Locals told stories about strange happenings at Ashgrove House, mysterious lights in the windows, echoes of footsteps, and, most chillingly, a staircase that never seemed to end. People claimed that those who dared to climb the staircase would hear whispers, feel unseen hands tugging at them, and in some cases, never be seen again. Unfazed by the tales, Lily decided to stay in the mansion for one night to write a true account of what she experienced. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and her notebook, she made her way to Ashgrove House just as the sun was setting. The mansion loomed over her, its windows like dark eyes watching her every step. Ivy clung to the brickwork, and the once grand front door hung slightly ajar, creaking as she pushed it open. Inside, dust hung heavy in the air, and the faint smell of decay lingered. Her footsteps echoed as she explored the main floor. She took photos of the abandoned rooms, each one filled with shadows and broken furniture. There was an eerie silence in the house, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. Then she found the staircase. It was a grand, sweeping staircase in the center of the house, covered in a layer of dust that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. As she stood at the bottom, She felt a strange compulsion to climb it, as though something unseen were urging her upward. Her flashlight flickered as she took the first step. The wood creaked under her weight, and the air grew colder with each step she took. She paused, listening, but all she heard was the soft rustling of the wind through the broken windows. But as she continued to climb, she noticed something strange. No matter how many steps she took, the top of the staircase never seemed to get any closer. It was as if the staircase stretched on forever, an endless spiral into darkness. A cold sweat broke out on her skin, and she tried to turn back, but when she looked down, the bottom of the staircase seemed to have disappeared, replaced by an impenetrable shadow. Panic set in as she realized she was trapped, unable to go up or down. Suddenly, she heard a whisper, a soft, eerie voice that seemed to come from all around her. "Keep going. They're waiting for you." The voice was followed by a childlike giggle, echoing up the staircase. Trembling, Lily continued to climb, hoping that the top would eventually come into view. But with each step, the shadows grew deeper, and the whispers grew louder until they filled her mind, drowning out her own thoughts. As she climbed, she saw things out of the corner of her eye, shadows flitting past, shapes that moved in the darkness. She heard footsteps echoing behind her, felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, but when she turned around, there was nothing there. Just as she was about to give up, she reached a landing. Her flashlight flickered again, illuminating a door at the end of a short hallway. The door was slightly open, revealing a faint light inside. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but she knew she had no choice but to go forward. Pushing the door open, she stepped into a room that looked untouched by time. A small table stood in the center, surrounded by empty chairs, as if someone had been expecting guests. On the table lay a collection of old photographs, each one showing the same family: a mother, a father, and two young children, all dressed in clothing from the early 1900s. But as she looked closer, she felt a chill. The faces in the photographs seemed wrong. Their eyes were wide, too wide, filled with a hollow, lifeless expression. And in each photo, the family was staring directly at the camera, as if looking right at her. Then, she noticed one last photograph at the edge of the table. It showed a young woman with curly hair, holding a camera in her hand. Her face was frozen in an expression of horror, her eyes wide with fear. It was a photo of herself. A gasp escaped her as she dropped the photograph, stumbling backward. Her flashlight went out completely, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for her phone, but it was dead. The whispers began again, louder now, filling the room with eerie laughter and soft, echoing cries. "Stay with us," the voices chanted. "Join us." Panicking, Lily tried to find her way back to the door, but the room seemed to have shifted. The walls felt closer, as if they were closing in around her. She clawed at the darkness, desperately searching for an exit, but the room seemed to stretch on endlessly, trapping her in a maze of shadows. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand grip her arm. She screamed, trying to pull away, but the hand held her firmly, dragging her deeper into the darkness. She struggled, her heart pounding as more hands reached out, gripping her shoulders, her legs, pulling her down into the shadows. As the darkness swallowed her, she heard one final whisper in her ear, soft and mocking. "Welcome home." The next morning, the townspeople noticed that Lily's car was still parked outside Ashgrove House. The police were called, and a search party entered the mansion, but there was no sign of her. They searched every room, every corner, but she was nowhere to be found. The only thing they discovered was her notebook, lying at the bottom of the staircase. The last entry read, "The staircase never ends." In the small, secluded town of Greystone, there was an old lighthouse on the cliffs known as Stormwatch Point. For over a century, it had guided ships safely along the rocky coast. But after the lighthouse keeper vanished mysteriously one night, it was abandoned, left to weather the storms alone. Decades later, the lighthouse gained a reputation. People claimed that on stormy nights, a single light could be seen shining from the top. followed by a figure moving slowly past the glass, though everyone knew no one lived there. They called it the Vanishing Light, and it became a legend of the town, a story told to scare visitors and children. But for Liam, an amateur ghost hunter and skeptic, the story of the Vanishing Light was just another tale waiting to be debunked. Determined to prove it was all just superstition, he packed his gear and set off for Greystone on a night when a storm was predicted to hit. He planned to spend the entire night at the lighthouse and record everything he saw and heard. He arrived at sunset, and by the time he reached Stormwatch Point, rain had begun to fall. The lighthouse loomed above him, its walls cracked and weather-beaten. As he approached, the wind howled, whipping through the broken windows, and a faint, eerie hum seemed to echo from within the structure. Liam took a deep breath, steadying himself, and pushed open the heavy door. Inside, the air was damp and stale, and his footsteps echoed off the stone walls as he made his way up the spiral staircase. Each step creaked under his weight, and the light from his flashlight flickered, casting long shadows along the walls. Finally, he reached the top. The observation room was empty, just as he'd expected, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Ignoring the unease, he set up his camera by the large, cracked window facing the sea, hoping to capture any sign of the supposed ghostly light. As the storm intensified, lightning flashed across the sky, briefly illuminating the room. In those split seconds of brightness, he thought he saw a shadow pass across the glass, but when he turned, there was nothing there. He dismissed it as his imagination, a trick of the storm. Hours passed, and despite his efforts to stay alert, Liam found himself dozing off. But just as he drifted into sleep, a loud clanging sound echoed from somewhere below, jolting him awake. He sat up, heart racing, listening as the sound grew louder, closer, as if someone were climbing the stairs toward him. Grabbing his flashlight, he shone it down the stairwell, but there was no one there. The only sound was the rain beating against the windows. Taking a deep breath, he called out, "Is someone there?" But his voice was swallowed by the silence. Then, just as he turned back toward the window, he froze. The lamp in the center of the room had turned on by itself, casting a pale, flickering glow across the floor. Liam's heart raced as he approached it, his hand reaching out tentatively. The light grew brighter as he stepped closer, and for a moment, he thought he heard a faint whisper. A voice, distant but clear. "Help me." The words sent a chill down his spine. He looked around, but he was alone. The whisper came again, softer, more desperate. "Please, help me." Just as he was about to respond, the light flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The only sound was his own rapid breathing and the pounding of his heart. Suddenly, the entire room was bathed in a blinding flash of lightning, and in that moment, he saw it. A figure standing in the corner, dressed in a long, tattered coat, its face hidden in shadows. The figure's eyes glowed faintly, staring at him with an intensity that sent him stumbling backward. The figure took a step toward him, and Liam felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though he were standing on the edge of a great void. He tried to back away, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. The whisper came again, but this time it was right next to him, chilling and hollow. "You're too late." The room spun, and he found himself falling, the walls blurring around him as he plummeted into darkness. He hit the ground with a jolt, gasping for breath, and realized he was lying at the base of the lighthouse stairs. Disoriented, he scrambled to his feet, his body aching. The storm was still raging outside, but as he looked around, he realized he wasn't alone. Figures stood in the shadows, watching him silently, their faces hidden. Each one wore the same tattered clothing, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were all around him, encircling him, their expressions empty and lifeless. Panicking, Liam stumbled toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figures began to close in, their hollow eyes fixed on him. He could hear their whispers now, overlapping, filling the room like a wave. "Stay with us. Don't leave. You're one of us now." Desperate, he slammed his fists against the door, screaming for help, but his voice was drowned out by the storm and the relentless whispers. The figures reached out, their cold hands brushing against him, and he felt an icy numbness spread through his body. As he sank to the floor, The last thing he saw was the faint glow of the lighthouse lamp above him, flickering one last time before it went out completely, plunging him into darkness. The next morning, the townspeople found his car abandoned by the road, but there was no sign of him. His camera was discovered at the base of the lighthouse stairs, the footage showing only static and a faint flickering light. To this day, on stormy nights, people claim to see a light shining from the top of Stormwatch Point, and if you listen closely, they say, you can hear faint whispers on the wind, calling for help, a warning to anyone who dares to approach the cursed lighthouse. Claire had always been fascinated by the house she inherited from her great-aunt. The mansion was large, filled with endless hallways and rooms that hadn't been touched in decades. Despite its old decaying state, Claire was excited to make it her own. She spent days cleaning and exploring each room, taking in the remnants of her family's past. One rainy afternoon, she stumbled upon a door she hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away behind an old, dusty tapestry in a dark corner of the third floor. The door was small and worn, with a rusty lock that looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. Curious, Claire tugged at the handle, and after a few tries, it creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. A chill ran down her spine, but curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed her flashlight and began her descent, the stairs groaning under her weight. The air grew colder as she went deeper, and a musty smell filled her lungs. At the bottom, she found herself in a long, narrow hallway lined with closed doors on either side. She opened the first door cautiously and shone her light inside. The room was empty, save for an old rocking chair and a small table covered in dust. As she continued down the hallway, she checked each room, only to find them all similarly bare and abandoned. But just as she was about to turn back, something caught her eye. At the end of the hallway, there was one final door, slightly ajar. Claire felt a strange pull toward it, a sense that this room held something important. She reached out and pushed it open, stepping inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from her flashlight. Unlike the other rooms, this one was furnished. A bed covered in old, decaying sheets, a wardrobe in the corner, and a mirror hanging on the wall. The air was thick, and an unsettling feeling settled over her, as though she weren't alone. As she scanned the room, her flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the corner. But when the light steadied, the room was empty. She shook her head, dismissing it as a trick of the shadows. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something in the mirror's reflection, a movement, a shadow passing behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Feeling a rising sense of dread, Claire backed away from the mirror, her gaze fixed on it. And then she saw it. A face, pale and expressionless, staring back at her from within the glass. Its eyes were hollow, empty, yet they seemed to follow her every move. Paralyzed, Claire watched as the figure in the mirror slowly raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. Her own reflection did not mimic the movement. Instead, the face in the mirror began to smile. A slow, chilling smile that sent a shiver down her spine. Heart pounding, Claire turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. She frantically tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, and she felt a presence closing in on her, an unseen force pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. "Why? Are you here?" a voice whispered, low and echoing, as if coming from all around her. Claire froze, her back against the door, her eyes darting around the room. Shadows seemed to gather, shifting and swirling, and the figure in the mirror stepped closer, its face twisted with malice. "Leave!" the voice hissed, and she felt a sudden, violent push, as though invisible hands were shoving her toward the mirror. She stumbled, catching herself just inches from the glass, staring into the hollow eyes of the figure. Desperate, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Please, let me go." For a moment there was silence. Then she felt a cold breath against her ear, and the voice whispered, "You're already here? With me?" Her eyes flew open, and she found herself staring into her own reflection. The room was empty, and the door was open behind her. Shaking, she rushed out, slamming the door shut and racing up the stairs, not daring to look back. When she reached the main floor, she turned to make sure the door was still closed. But the hallway where she'd found it was gone, replaced by a solid wall. The door, the staircase, the forgotten room, they had all vanished. For days after, she tried to find that hidden hallway again, convinced that she hadn't imagined it. But no matter how hard she looked, it was as if the room had never existed. Yet sometimes, late at night, she would hear a faint whisper echoing through the mansion, a voice calling her name, asking her to return to the forgotten room that now only existed in her nightmares. It was the house everyone in the town of Millfield spoke about in whispers. The Blackwood Manor sat alone at the top of a hill, abandoned and shrouded in mist, its once grand structure now crumbling with age. Locals said the house was cursed, that anyone who entered was haunted by nightmares or worse. Some never returned. It was said that the house had eyes, that it was watching, waiting for someone to stay long enough to become a part of its dark history. Despite the warnings, Olivia, a determined journalist with a fascination for the paranormal, decided to investigate the manor. She had spent years chasing ghost stories and supernatural rumors, and Blackwood Manor seemed to be the perfect place for her next article. Arriving just as the sun began to set, she parked her car at the bottom of the hill and began the hike up the winding path to the house. As she approached, the air grew colder, and the trees surrounding the manor seemed to lean in, as if trying to block her way. When she finally stood before the house, Olivia felt a sense of dread. The windows stared down at her like dark, hollow eyes, and the front door hung slightly open, as if inviting her inside. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through the door and into the grand foyer. Dust hung in the air, and the scent of mold and decay was overwhelming. Her footsteps echoed through the vast, empty halls as she began to explore, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. Each room she entered was filled with old furniture covered in sheets, as if the house were holding on to memories of a time long past. As she made her way through the mansion, she noticed something odd. Each room had mirrors, positioned to reflect every corner of the space. They were covered in dust, but she could still see faint reflections, distorted and unclear. The deeper she went, the more she felt as though she were being watched. She would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of her eye, shadows shifting, figures passing by. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Finally, she reached the library, a vast room filled with towering bookshelves and ancient tomes. In the center of the room stood a large mirror, taller than she was, its glass cracked and foggy. Drawn to it, Olivia stepped closer, examining the intricate carvings along the frame. That's when she noticed her reflection wasn't quite right. Her face stared back at her, but her eyes were wrong. Empty, hollow, almost lifeless. She stepped back, her heart pounding, but the reflection didn't move with her. Instead, it raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, and she heard a faint whisper. "Come closer." A shiver ran down her spine, and she backed away, but her reflection remained, staring at her with that hollow gaze. She turned to leave the room, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. She tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. As she pounded on the door, a slow creaking sound filled the room, and she turned to see the mirror shifting, as if something were pressing against it from the other side. "Help me." The voice was louder now, echoing through the room. She covered her ears, trying to drown it out, but it only grew stronger, filling her mind with a sense of despair. The mirror seemed to ripple like water, and she saw faces within it. Faces twisted with fear, their mouths open in silent screams. Suddenly, one of the faces pressed against the glass, its hands clawing desperately, as if trying to escape. Olivia stumbled backward, horrified, as more faces appeared, each one reaching out, their eyes filled with terror. In a panic, she grabbed a chair and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, pieces flying across the room, but the voices didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, filling her head with a deafening roar. She stumbled out of the library, her only thought to escape the house. As she ran through the halls, she realized they seemed longer, as if the house were stretching, twisting to keep her trapped. Doors appeared where they hadn't been before, and she found herself running in circles, disoriented and terrified. Finally, she spotted the front door. She sprinted toward it, her heart racing, but just as she reached out to open it, the door vanished, replaced by a solid wall. She screamed, pounding on the wall, but it was no use. Turning around, she saw that the mirrors along the walls were filled with faces, all watching her, their eyes hollow and accusing. She recognized some of them from photographs she'd seen of people who had gone missing in the house. Now they were trapped here, and she was one of them. As the voices grew louder, she felt herself being pulled toward one of the mirrors, an invisible force dragging her closer. She fought against it, but her body moved on its own, her hand reaching out to touch the glass. The surface was cold, and as her hand pressed against it, her reflection smiled, a cruel, twisted smile that didn't match her own. She felt a strange sensation, like she was being pulled through the mirror, her surroundings growing dark and distorted. In the final moments, she realized the truth. The house didn't just watch. It collected, trapping souls within its mirrors, feeding on their fear and despair, keeping them there for eternity. And as her vision faded, she knew she was now a part of the house's endless, watching eyes, waiting for the next person foolish enough to enter. For as long as anyone could remember, the Whispering Woods had been off limits. The locals believed the woods were haunted. They said that anyone who ventured too far in would hear whispers calling their name, luring them deeper and deeper until they were never seen again. When Nathan moved to the nearby town, he dismissed the stories as silly legends meant to keep kids from wandering alone in the forest. But curiosity got the better of him, and one evening, he decided to see the woods for himself. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of adventure, he set off along the narrow, overgrown path leading into the forest just as the sun was setting. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, crickets, and rustling leaves, vanished, replaced by a heavy, unnatural silence. His footsteps seemed to echo in the stillness, and as he looked around, he realized he couldn't see the way he'd come. The path had disappeared, replaced by endless rows of twisted trees, their branches forming dark, reaching shadows. Despite his rising unease, he pressed on. After walking for what felt like hours, he stopped to catch his breath, shining his flashlight around. That's when he heard it. A faint whisper, soft and distant, calling his name. Nathan. He froze, his heart pounding. The voice was barely audible, almost like the rustling of leaves, but it was unmistakable. Shaking it off as his imagination, he took a few steps forward. Nathan. The voice came again, louder this time, as if it were right beside him. He spun around but saw only shadows shifting in the trees. A chill ran down his spine and he told himself it was just the wind. But as he continued on, the whispering grew more insistent, calling his name over and over, drawing him deeper into the woods. Nathan. Come closer. Despite his fear, he felt compelled to follow the voice. It was soothing, almost comforting, and it filled him with a strange sense of longing. The trees seemed to close in around him, guiding him down an unseen path, their branches reaching out like fingers. After a few more steps, he saw a faint light ahead, flickering like a distant candle. Entranced, he moved toward it, his pace quickening as the whispers grew louder, more excited. The light led him to a small clearing, and in the center stood an old, crumbling stone well. The whispers seemed to come from within, echoing up from the depths. As he approached, the whispers stopped, replaced by a silence so deep it felt oppressive. He peered over the edge, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but he couldn't see the bottom. The silence stretched on, and just as he was about to turn away, he heard a voice. A different voice this time, soft and childlike. Help me! The plea sent a chill down his spine. He looked around, but there was no one else in the clearing. The voice came again, louder this time, Help me. I'm trapped." He hesitated, torn between the urge to help and the overwhelming fear gnawing at him. Finally, he called out, "Where are you?" The voice replied, "Down here. Please, help." Driven by a mix of curiosity and compassion, he leaned farther over the edge, trying to see into the well. As he did, he felt something cold brush against his shoulder, like icy fingers trailing across his skin. Startled, he spun around, but there was nothing there. When he turned back to the well, the voice was gone, replaced by the same eerie silence. Frustrated and unnerved, he stepped back from the well, but as he did, he felt a tug on his arm, pulling him back toward it. He struggled, but the force was strong, relentless, dragging him closer to the edge. He clawed at the ground, fighting against the unseen force, but it was no use. Inch by inch, he was pulled closer until he was leaning over the edge, staring into the darkness below. And then he saw it. A face, pale and hollow-eyed, staring up at him from the depths. The face smiled, its lips curling into a twisted grin, and he realized with horror that it was his own face, distorted and lifeless. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, filling his mind with a cacophony of voices, all calling his name. He screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. The last thing he saw was his own reflection, staring back at him with empty eyes as he was pulled into the darkness. The next morning, the townspeople found Nathan's flashlight lying in the clearing, but there was no sign of him. The well remained silent, and the woods were as quiet as ever. But if you listen closely on a still night, they say you can still hear the whispers, calling out the names of those who dare to enter the whispering woods, luring them to their fate. Jake had always been drawn to old hotels. There was something about their history, their faded glamour, that intrigued him. During a solo road trip, he stumbled upon the Blackwood Inn, a sprawling, crumbling hotel nestled deep in the mountains. The town surrounding it was nearly deserted, with only a few people lingering around who seemed unwilling to even look at the inn. When he asked the receptionist about it, she gave him a strained smile. "Most people don't stay here more than a night," she said. "They say strange things happen here." Jake shrugged it off, thinking it was just a gimmick to attract curious guests. He booked a room on the 5th floor, eager to experience whatever strange things the inn had to offer. That night, after a late dinner, he made his way up the dimly lit staircase, the old carpet softening his footsteps. The hallways were long and empty, the wallpaper peeling and faded. His room, 512, was at the very end of the hall. The door was heavy and creaked as he opened it, revealing a dimly lit, outdated room with a single bed, a small desk, and a window with thick, dusty curtains. He set down his bags, locked the door, and stretched out on the bed, tired from his journey. But as soon as he closed his eyes, he heard it, a faint whisper, just barely audible, coming from somewhere in the room. "Welcome." Jake sat up, scanning the room, but there was no one there. He shook it off, blaming it on his exhaustion, and lay back down. But the whispering continued, growing louder, surrounding him. "Welcome to our room." A chill ran down his spine. He turned on the bedside lamp, the dim light casting shadows across the walls. He listened closely, but now there was only silence. Reassuring himself that it was just his imagination, he turned off the light and tried to sleep. Hours passed and Jake finally drifted off, but he was awakened by a strange, scratching noise. It sounded like something was clawing at the walls, slow and deliberate, inching closer to him. He held his breath, heart pounding, as the sound moved from the far wall to the door. He called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The scratching stopped, replaced by silence. But as he lay there, listening, he noticed something else. His door handle was slowly turning, creaking as it twisted. Fear gripping him, Jake jumped out of bed and ran to the door, pushing it shut and securing the deadbolt. He backed away, his mind racing. Deciding he couldn't stay in the room any longer, He grabbed his things and went to the door, but it wouldn't open. Panicking, he pulled harder, jiggling the handle, but the door remained locked, as though it were sealed from the other side. He grabbed his phone to call the front desk, but there was no signal. Frustrated, he tried the window, but it wouldn't budge either. He was trapped. A soft laugh echoed through the room, and he spun around, his heart racing. The laughter grew louder, filling the room, bouncing off the walls. He covered his ears, but it seemed to come from everywhere. Desperate, he began pounding on the walls, shouting for help. But the walls felt strange, soft and spongy, as though they were breathing. His hands sank into them, and he recoiled, staring in horror as the wallpaper began to pulse like it was alive. The whispers returned, louder and closer, as if they were coming from within the walls themselves. "Stay with us." The room seemed to close in around him, the walls narrowing, pressing closer. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the whispers grew more insistent. "Stay with us. Forever." Jake backed into a corner, watching in terror as the walls slowly moved inward. Shadows danced across the room, shifting and swirling, forming faces with hollow eyes and twisted smiles, all watching him, closing in. With a final burst of panic, he slammed his shoulder into the door, desperate to escape. The door gave way, and he stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. But the hallway wasn't the same as before. It was endless, stretching out in both directions, lined with doors that all looked exactly like his own. He ran, his footsteps echoing in the silence, but no matter how far he went, he couldn't find the staircase. Every door he passed was locked, and every turn led him back to the same stretch of hallway. Finally, he stopped, breathing heavily, and turned to look behind him. The hallway was empty, but he could feel something watching him, a presence lurking just beyond his sight. He tried one more door, hoping it would lead him back to the lobby, but it opened into his room, room 512. Confused, he looked down the hall, but it was gone. The only thing in front of him was his room, the door open, inviting him in. Defeated, he stepped inside, hoping to find another way out. But as soon as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him. He turned, pounding on the door, but it was no use. The whispers filled the room once more, louder than ever. "Welcome back." He looked around, horrified as the walls began to pulse again, closing in on him. The last thing he saw was his own terrified reflection in the window, staring back at him with hollow eyes, before the room consumed him, leaving nothing but silence. The next morning, the maid found room 512 empty, just as it always was. No luggage, no sign of a guest. The receptionist checked the records, but there was no record of anyone staying in room 512. Just as it had been for years. But on quiet nights, when the hotel is empty, some say you can still hear faint whispers echoing through the halls, calling out for help as if someone is still trying to escape the room with no exit. Long ago, Black Hollow Manor was the grandest estate in the region, an imposing mansion sitting at the edge of the dark, sprawling Black Hollow forest. But after a series of mysterious disappearances in the early 1900s, the owners left, abandoning the house to decay. Over the years, locals whispered tales of ghostly sightings and strange sounds echoing through its empty halls. Few dared to go near it. One night, a group of friends, Emma, Lucas, Mia, and Tom, decided to investigate Black Hollow Manor for fun. They had heard the ghost stories since childhood and wanted to see if there was any truth to them. Armed with flashlights, they set out after dark, laughing nervously as they approached the dilapidated building. The front door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a grand foyer lined with dusty portraits and a grand staircase that led to the upper floors. The air was thick with dust and a strange lingering smell that made the group uneasy. Still, they pressed on, shining their flashlights around the room and daring each other to explore further. "Let's split up and see what we can find," Lucas suggested with a grin, though his eyes betrayed a hint of fear. Emma and Lucas headed upstairs, while Mia and Tom stayed on the main floor, exploring the maze-like hallways. As they walked, they noticed that the walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deeply into the wood. Some looked like twisted faces, while others were words in a language they didn't recognize. Meanwhile, Emma and Lucas made their way to the second floor, where the doors to the rooms stood ajar, each one dark and silent. They cautiously entered one of the rooms and found it filled with old, decaying furniture covered in dust. As they looked around, they heard faint whispering, too soft to make out the words. They froze, glancing at each other. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered. Lucas nodded, shining his flashlight around the room. The whispering grew louder, echoing around them, but they couldn't see anyone. Suddenly they heard footsteps outside the door, slow and deliberate, as if someone were pacing back and forth. "Maybe it's Tom and Mia," Lucas said, though he didn't sound convinced. They stepped into the hallway, but it was empty. The footsteps continued, moving away from them, down the hall. The two friends followed, trying to keep their own steps quiet, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the house itself were changing, shifting. Meanwhile, on the main floor, Mia and Tom wandered into the dining room. A long table, covered in a decaying moth-eaten cloth, dominated the room. Candles, melted and hardened into strange shapes, sat on the table, and the air was thick with the scent of old wax. "Look at this," Mia said, pointing to a massive, tarnished mirror hanging on the wall. They moved closer, their reflections dim and distorted in the cracked glass. As they looked, Mia gasped. Their reflections weren't matching their movements. In the mirror, she saw herself staring blankly ahead, her eyes dark and hollow, while Tom's reflection stood perfectly still, watching her with a twisted smile. "Mia?" Tom's voice pulled her out of her trance, and she looked away from the mirror, feeling a chill down her spine. But before she could respond, the lights in the room flickered, and the faint sound of laughter echoed through the hallways. The laughter grew louder, filling the room, and they realized it was coming from all around them, as if the walls themselves were laughing. "Let's find the others," Tom said, his voice trembling. They left the dining room, the laughter fading behind them. But as they moved through the hallways, they noticed something strange. The rooms and hallways didn't seem to lead where they should. Every door they opened led them in circles, back to rooms they'd already passed. Upstairs, Emma and Lucas found themselves in what appeared to be the master bedroom. A massive four-poster bed stood in the center of the room, covered in decayed, moth-eaten sheets. Dust particles floated in the air, and the smell of old wood and mildew was overpowering. As they explored, they noticed a small door in the corner of the room, partially hidden by a tapestry. Curiosity got the better of them, and they opened it, revealing a narrow, dark staircase leading downward. "Should we go down?" Emma whispered, her flashlight casting long shadows down the stairs. Lucas nodded, and they began their descent, the stairs creaking under their weight. The air grew colder the farther they went, and they felt an oppressive presence, as if something were waiting for them below. Finally, they reached the bottom and found themselves in a small, windowless room. Strange symbols covered the walls, and in the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, similar to the one Mia and Tom had seen. But this mirror was different. The glass seemed to ripple, as if it were made of liquid. They approached it, drawn by an invisible force. As they stared into the mirror, they saw their own reflections, but something was wrong. Their reflections were smiling, cold, twisted smiles that didn't match the fear on their faces. Suddenly, Emma's reflection raised a hand and waved, her face distorted into a horrible grin. She stumbled backward, grabbing Lucas's arm, but when she looked back at the mirror, her reflection was gone. A voice echoed in the room, soft and mocking. "Welcome. We've been waiting for you." The room began to close in on them, the walls pulsing and shifting, and they realized with horror that they were trapped. They ran back up the stairs, but the steps seemed endless, stretching on and on as if they would never reach the top. Meanwhile, Mia and Tom found themselves in a similar predicament, lost in a maze of hallways that seemed to loop back on themselves. They tried calling for Emma and Lucas, but their voices were swallowed by the silence. Desperate, they opened another door, hoping to find an exit, but instead, they found themselves back in the dining room. The candles on the table were lit now, their flames flickering, and shadows danced across the walls. At the head of the table sat a figure, shrouded in darkness. They couldn't make out its face, but they felt its gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed on them. "Sit," the figure said, its voice low and commanding. Compelled by an invisible force, they moved toward the table, their bodies no longer under their control. They sat down, and the figure leaned forward, revealing a face twisted with malice, its eyes dark and hollow. "Welcome to Black Hollow Manor," it whispered, grinning. "You'll never leave." The friends were never seen again. To this day, Black Hollow Manor stands empty, a forgotten relic with dark secrets buried within its walls. And on quiet nights, some say you can still hear the faint sounds of laughter and whispers, as the souls of those trapped within call out, waiting for someone to join them. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight. I hope you found some peace and comfort. Before you drift off completely, let me know in the comments what time it is, where you are, and which country you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. Until next time, rest well and sweet dreams.